What is that?
What is that? It was just something that I shot. My camera does mirror images so that it makes two iguanas, and there's something up top that looks like a religious icon of some kind. But it all worked as a single image. I don't have a real idea about how it's going to work going in. It's like the problem of starting a painting. You start with a white surface, which for me is like visually the most beautiful thing that I can look at. I make a mark, or I do something to alter the shape of a piece of wood, and that sort of dictates the next mark or the next stroke. This was just a shot of a store window in Burlington using this camera that does mirror images, and there's something about the image itself that, regardless of its subject matter, has a design to it that projects depth for me. For about a year, really fascinated with how depth is projected in images, how the human visual system produces the sensation of depth from a so-called flat screen or a two-dimensional image. And what I found was that different people respond to different visual cues, so that for some of them, for a small percentage, a face or an imagined face needs to be present in order for a depth projection to take place. In a lot of my work, the depth depends on different arrangements of color.
You walked in needing some assistance with this slideshow that we're looking at in preparation for an exhibit that you were doing at Genelia Research Campus.
Yeah.
This is like the Manhattan Project of neuroscience.
That's right. I can describe Genelia and their work, I think, fairly briefly. It's in Northern Virginia, not too far from Dulles Airport. The place is full of prestigious scientists, most of whom are focused in neuroscience, in molecular neuroscience. And they've accomplished some things that have been sort of necessary to producing the whole next generation of neuroscience. They've been so successful that their mission may change. My son is one of their lead researchers. He has his own lab there, or actually two labs. He saw some of my shots of Genelia, and the way, this is one of them, and the way that I had edited them. He suggested, hey, Dad, you could have a show there maybe if they like your work. They actually got excited about the way that I had done depictions of their campus. They offered to print and frame my photos with the understanding that they would give them to me afterwards. What I did was to conceive in my own way of a way to give people an experience of their own community through my art. These are a group of some of the top scientists in the world on their way to so-called Bob's Pub, designed for everyone to gather. So many millions and millions of dollars are put into just the setup of a lab. And one of the main activities is these regular excursions from the lab to Bob's Pub, where everybody drinks coffee together, and then back to their individual labs where some work gets done before they come back. Just standing in one of three places would capture most of that activity. I didn't take shots of the labs themselves. This is one of my shots of Genelia. Genelia doesn't really look like that, but people in that community could figure out what that angle is and where I was standing, or at least some of them could. Just giving people my own sort of impression, intimate insight into certain aspects of the space that they were working in, that their community exists in. The whole front facade of the place is just one whole piece of glass, which has different reflective qualities. What I began to see in the images as I brought out different qualities of color and depth and so forth, this huge internal space, which is supposed to be completely open, with this long window facade to the outside, had sections of glass paneling that sort of channeled where people were able to move around in this very large space. What I began to understand was that my subject was glass, or seeing through these different layers of transparencies. This is a straight shot with some enhancements of part of their campus. You can see that the glass, both allows you to see all the way through, but that it interrupts vision and it sort of limits where a person can be or channels where they can be or where they can't be and so forth. And I think of that as really symbolic of the way that our experience as individuals is limited to personal points of view. I did all of this with a little point and shoot. And as soon as they blow it up, every single amateurish mistake is going to just blast itself out into this community that is full of some of the top photographers in the world. I mean, Leica sends a $20,000, $30,000 camera to one of these people every single year, something new, just to find out what he's going to do with it. That's outside of Genelia at night, taken with a very inexpensive point-and-shoot camera several years ago. That camera was just not capable of collecting all the light necessary, so it just broke it up. I got a better camera, and I went back down there, and I spent about a week and a half just shooting, probably about 20,000 shots. And then I spent about a year organizing these things and selecting them for different kinds of editing. I think I edited about 2,000 shots in terms of the way that I produce images. And out of that, I was supposed to select 20 to be printed. That portion of my entire exhibit that I had planned as a kind of an illustrated pamphlet that explained my own theory of mind and consciousness, mostly in visual form. I got sick in the middle of this. So I did what they had expected me to do, which was to produce an exhibit. But what I didn't do was to produce that little pamphlet that said what my interest in doing the whole thing was in the first place. What I really wanted to express to anybody who would sort of listen is that underlying our personal points of view, there may be a way to test for an underlying ground of reality that we all share. Many years ago, I went to a conference center that had launched a meeting of many of the people who were doing research in this field at that time, one of whom was Karl Pribram. Very solid hypothesis about how our nervous system is geared to processing the world as it is, that has to do with holographic theory and brain processing. The debate about this man's work had gone back and forth in many different scientific journals and in the New Age journal, and he was sort of on track for a Nobel Prize. And then he said some very unfortunate things about his work. What he said was that because he understood his theory so well, he was able to travel back in time and teach this whole theory to the people who wrote the Upanishads in ancient India. He said this thing and was erased. The people who are working in the development of artificial intelligence don't care what anybody says about their work. They just want to know what works. By the way, I have to say that I'm not an apocalyptic thinker. I don't. I'm not neither an advocate nor a doomsday person. I've tracked the research, so I know what's being used in those fields. Where there are peepholes through into something that is real for both of us and is the same for both of us, or is where there are points of intimacy or connection that it requires nothing more than to be really present to another person. And I can only tell you that this is my way of thinking through my belief that a lot of people experience openings into a common reality, that it doesn't take a special kind of person, that we call it empathy, to experience what somebody else is experiencing, to be in their place. It happens through different forms of shared intense experience. People every once in a while have an experience of loving each other that opens into a common reality that is then, I believe, shared by, shareable by, not just by those two people, but is common to everyone. Joy, intense experiences of joy. To the extent that I'm trying to do something with my art is to create opportunities for these openings or connections to happen. I had an exhibit at the same library about 16 months ago, and at the opening, dear person who happens to be, today they call it sight challenged, but he can't see, fell in love with one of my sculptures. This very dear person had felt something directly that I had intended to be there, both tactually and visually. I use a combination of power tools and hand chisels and many different kinds of sanders. A lot of what I look for when I'm doing or creating a sculpture is the experience that I'm going to have putting the finish on it. You know, the surface of things is what we tend to experience. The depth behind that surface is what I wanted to speak with the people at Genalia about. But the surface is what we have available to our lenses, to the sort of glass that we look through. Each one of us has an individual signature that when we express ourselves in conversation or in art, it can be recognized. The demonstration of that signature in the work of some of the great classical composers or some of the distinguished jazz artists, what you could call a gesture, is recognizable, that guy or that woman. And each one of us has one of those. It's like our incontrovertible voice. I think of art, the expression of art, as a chance to go through all of this work in creating something that will carry that signature in such a way that one of those connections that I was talking about between myself and someone else, it doesn't always just happen through art. Those connections, I think, are key to who we are. Some of my relationship to art is grounded in some of the deepest grief I've ever experienced, in terms of my closest friend who, he didn't exactly teach me, he suggested I just keep on drawing until one day I had drawn something and he started jumping up and down, and that's it. His death, which came as a sort of direct result of the state of mind that he was in that produced his vision. A lot of what I do in my writing is to carry forward a promise that we both made to each other. I mean, I don't know how to state that promise except that it had to do with being real to our art and to not compromising it. I mean, I have no way of telling whether my art has any so-called artistic value. I don't really care. Somebody says, I like that or I don't like it. Somebody will look at an image and say, what am I looking at? That is so much more the response to my work that I want than, oh, this is really wonderful. Well, that was a shot that I took a long time ago, and originally it was a double exposure. Exposure of a Tibetan tanka with a portrait of my wife, double exposed. And then when I ran it through something like Photoshop, a lot of the depth and colors came out and made it something that I, at that point, that I wanted to share. Up until then, it was just a sort of private experience between my wife and myself. The work that I'm doing now is much more focused on and in Burlington. I think I shared with you that I wrote a poem a while ago that was derived from photographs of my street at a time when it was so beautiful, just so visually rich, that it's not an ode, but a paean to my neighborhood, which doesn't avoid any of the blemishes that that come along with it. I live in the Old North End, and I love living there. From Genalia, the same show went to Howard Hughes Medical Institute, where it was for 2 months. They hired an art handler. I love that name. Alter ego from this point on is art handler. Anyway, the guy showed up, and he hand-delivered the whole thing to the Fletcher Free Library in downtown Burlington.
And you have both some work that was created for Genalia and some images of Burlington?
This is a Burlington cat. It was a cat looking through a screen.
You're going to have a reception at the library?
Yes, there'll be a reception inviting the entire world. It's April 6th, starting at 6 o'clock. It'll run till 9. I was in conversation with one of my grandchildren who was at that time 4 years old. We're talking about something and he says, "Oh, I can't say that." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because it's in the language of dust." And that phrase, it knocked me awake. And I said, "What do you mean, the language of dust?" And he said, "I can't tell you." There's this whole dimension of reality, that we live in, that you can't say anything about at all. It's one of the most beautiful teachings I ever received in my life.